When people imagine a queen's wedding night, they usually imagine privacy. Two people, alone, behind a closed door, while the rest of the court continues celebrating somewhere else in the building. For most of European history, that image is incorrect. A royal wedding night was rarely a private event. It was treated as a legal procedure, one that needed proof, paperwork, and, frequently, an audience. A marriage involving a future king or queen was not considered complete until it had been physically consummated, and because a kingdom's entire line of succession could depend on that single fact, families, courtiers, ambassadors, and sometimes priests made sure they were close enough to confirm it. Today we are looking at what really happened on a queen's wedding night, from the formal bedding ceremony that turned a young bride's first night into a public event, to the very specific disasters it produced across European royal history, and how, centuries later, the same ritual quietly disappeared behind a locked door. Some of these stories shaped religious history. Some of them shaped the personal reputations of women who had almost no control over what happened to them. All of them involve a level of scrutiny that would be unthinkable for a private wedding night today. The custom at the center of all this was known as the bedding ceremony. It existed across medieval and early modern Europe in slightly different forms, but the basic structure stayed the same. After the wedding feast, the bride and groom were undressed, sometimes by their own family members, sometimes by court attendants, and led to a decorated bed in front of witnesses. A priest or bishop would bless the bed itself. In some regions, bridesmaids and groomsmen sat at the foot of the bed and threw the couple's stockings over their shoulders. And if a thrown stocking happened to hit the bride or groom, it was taken as a sign that the thrower would marry soon. Wine or a sweetened drink, sometimes called a posset, was shared. Only after all of this did the curtains close around the bed. In parts of what is now Germany, the entire ceremony was carried out to the sound of pipes and drums, played loudly enough to drown out whatever happened once the couple was alone. In medieval Iceland, a marriage was not even considered legally valid unless the bedding ritual had been witnessed by at least 6 men. For ordinary couples, the witnesses usually left the room once the curtains closed. For royalty, the rules were not always so generous. The reason witnesses mattered so much was legal rather than romantic. In several medieval legal systems, particularly in Scandinavia, a marriage was not considered fully binding until the bedding ritual had taken place in front of others. Without consummation, a marriage could later be annulled, which meant any political alliance built on that marriage could collapse, any dowry could be reclaimed, and any children born afterward could be declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. For a royal family, an unconsummated marriage was not simply an embarrassing rumor. It was a direct risk to the dynasty itself. So, when royal couples married, it became common practice for someone, often a trusted relative or a member of the court, to remain present or close enough to confirm what had happened. One of the clearest examples of why this mattered took place in 1501, when 15-year-old Catherine of Aragon married Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the new Tudor dynasty in England. After the wedding feast, Catherine was put to bed by her ladies, and Arthur was undressed by his own attendants and brought to her. What exactly happened next would be argued over for the next 5 centuries, because 4.5 months later, Arthur was dead, and the answer to that one question would eventually help decide the future of the English monarchy. The morning after the wedding, according to testimony later given by Arthur's own attendant, Sir Anthony Willoughby, the young prince called for a cup of ale and claimed he had spent the night in what he described as the midst of Spain. Catherine's own household told a different story, describing Arthur as a frail and sickly teenager who had not been physically capable of completing the marriage. At a formal trial held decades later in 1529, members of Catherine's own Spanish entourage testified under oath that Arthur had been so weak and physically underdeveloped that intercourse would have been impossible. Catherine herself maintained for the rest of her life that the marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. The question only became urgent 8 years later, when Catherine married Arthur's younger brother, who became King Henry VIII. Under church law, marrying your dead brother's widow normally required special permission, which the Pope granted on the understanding that the first marriage might not have been completed. Decades later, when Henry wanted to end his marriage to Catherine in order to marry Anne Boleyn, he reopened the entire argument, claiming the first marriage had in fact been consummated, which would make his marriage to Catherine invalid under church law. Catherine refused to back down, insisting publicly and under oath that she had come to her second marriage a virgin. The dispute eventually contributed to England's break from the Catholic Church and the creation of the Church of England, all traceable back to a wedding night that nobody but two teenagers had actually witnessed. Not every royal wedding night involved this much ambiguity. Some involved an uncomfortable amount of certainty. In January 1540, King Henry VIII married his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, a German princess he had agreed to marry based largely on a flattering portrait. When he met her in person, he was reportedly displeased and looked for a way out of the marriage, but the political alliance with Cleves was already too valuable to cancel, so the wedding went ahead anyway. The wedding night that followed has been described by the historian David Loades as a complete failure, and surviving accounts suggest the marriage was never physically consummated at all. The following morning, Henry reportedly told his advisors that he had liked her badly enough before the wedding and liked her considerably less afterward. When Anne's own ladies questioned her about the night, she reportedly told them that her husband had simply kissed her, called her sweetheart at night and darling in the morning, with nothing more happening in between. Henry later tried to use the lack of consummation as grounds for an annulment, and during the legal proceedings, his royal physician testified that the king had experienced what was politely recorded as nocturnal emissions throughout the marriage, offered as proof that nothing was wrong with him specifically. The marriage was annulled within 6 months, after an assembly of English clergy formally ruled that it had never been consummated, and was therefore void from the very beginning. Thomas Cromwell, the advisor who had arranged the match in the first place, was executed the same day Henry married his fifth wife. In some royal marriages, the witnesses did not simply confirm the consummation afterward. They stayed in the room for it. When the future King William III of England married his cousin Mary in 1677, the bedding ceremony was carried out with King Charles II himself present in the bedroom, reportedly offering encouragement and advice to the young couple before the curtains were drawn. A similar arrangement applied decades earlier in France, when the 14-year-old Louis XIII married Anne of Austria in 1615. According to several historical accounts, Louis was reportedly carried to the marriage bed, and 2 royal nurses remained in the room while the marriage was consummated. The next morning, his mother, acting as Queen Regent, reportedly examined the bedsheets herself, looking for physical evidence that the marriage had been completed. The nurses assured her that it had happened twice. Louis did not return to his wife's bed again for several years afterward, a personal decision that nonetheless created serious diplomatic concern, since the entire alliance with Spain depended on Anne eventually producing an heir. In both of these cases, the presence of witnesses inside the room was treated less as a personal humiliation and more as a routine legal safeguard, recorded and discussed afterward with the same seriousness as any other piece of state business. A similar arrangement, with far worse personal consequences, defined the wedding night of the future Catherine the Great. In 1745, the 16-year-old German princess, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, married her second cousin Peter, heir to the Russian throne, in a ceremony arranged by his aunt, the reigning Empress Elizabeth. According to Catherine's own later memoirs, her new husband left her alone in the marriage bed on their wedding night in order to have supper and spend time with his own servants, eventually arriving late, smelling strongly of alcohol and tobacco. He lay down beside her, laughed, and remarked that his servants would find it amusing to see the two of them in bed together, then fell asleep. Catherine remained awake beside him for the rest of the night. The following morning, her lady-in-waiting questioned her directly about what had happened, and Catherine had no answer to give, because nothing had happened at all. In her memoirs, Catherine wrote that this exact situation continued without change for the next 9 years. The marriage stayed unconsummated for so long that Empress Elizabeth eventually concluded the couple needed outside help, and is widely reported to have encouraged both of them to take lovers privately, in the hope that experience elsewhere might solve the problem between them. Catherine's first child, a son named Paul who would later become heir to the Russian throne, is believed by many historians to have been fathered not by Peter, but by one of Catherine's lovers, Sergei Saltykov. 17 years after that first failed wedding night, Catherine removed Peter from power entirely and ruled Russia herself. A nearly identical situation played out a generation later at the French court, with consequences that reached far beyond the royal bedroom. In May 1770, 14-year-old Marie Antoinette, an Austrian archduchess, married the 15-year-old Dauphin of France, the future Louis XVI, as part of a political alliance between two countries that had spent generations as enemies. Following French royal custom, courtiers accompanied the newly married couple into their bedroom and remained present while the couple settled into bed, exactly as had been done for French royalty for generations before them. What followed was 7 years of an unconsummated marriage, a length of time that became the subject of open speculation across the entire French court and eventually across Europe. According to French royal physicians at the time, Louis appears to have suffered from a physical condition, most likely phimosis, that made intercourse painful, though the exact medical details were debated then and remain debated by historians now. Marie Antoinette's own mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, treated the situation as a matter of state, repeatedly writing to her daughter with instructions on how to behave toward her husband in order to encourage consummation. The lack of an heir contributed to years of rumor and political instability, since a childless queen with no obvious physical relationship with her husband became a convenient target during a period when criticism of the monarchy was already growing. The situation was only resolved in 1777, after Marie Antoinette's older brother, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, personally visited Versailles and spoke frankly with both his sister and her husband about the problem. According to the Château de Versailles' own historical archives, the marriage was finally consummated weeks after that visit, and Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child the following year. A similar pattern, separated by 25 years and an entirely different country, played out in the marriage of George, Prince of Wales, later King George IV of Great Britain, and his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. The two had never met before Caroline's arrival in England, just days before the wedding in April 1795, and the meeting that finally brought them together went badly within seconds. According to the diplomat Lord Malmesbury, who had escorted Caroline from Germany, George took one look at his bride, immediately asked for a glass of brandy, and told Malmesbury he felt unwell. Caroline was no more impressed, reportedly complaining that the prince was considerably heavier than his portrait suggested and far less attractive in person. George had agreed to the marriage largely because Parliament had offered to pay off his enormous personal debts in exchange for it, despite the fact that he was already secretly and illegally married to a commoner named Maria Fitzherbert. By the time the wedding ceremony took place, George had reportedly spent the previous 3 days drinking heavily, and his own groomsmen had to physically support him so he could complete the vows. The wedding night that followed has become one of the most frequently retold disasters in British royal history. According to Caroline's own later account, her new husband spent most of the night collapsed on the floor of their bedroom, having fallen near the fireplace grate in a state of extreme intoxication, where she left him until morning. In a private letter written afterward, George himself claimed the couple had only had intercourse a handful of times during the entire marriage, describing the experience as something he had to force himself through. Despite the open hostility between them, the marriage produced one child, Princess Charlotte, born 9 months after the wedding. George and Caroline separated permanently within a year. Decades later, when George finally became king, he had Caroline, by then technically his queen consort, barred from even attending his own coronation. Much of what we know about these wedding nights comes from sources that were never meant to become public. Catherine the Great's own memoirs, court testimony given decades after the fact, private letters exchanged between mothers and daughters, and diplomatic dispatches written by ambassadors who were paid to notice everything about the people they had been sent to observe. None of these sources are perfectly reliable. People exaggerate, embellish, and occasionally lie outright, especially when the answer to a single private question could end a marriage, threaten an alliance, or decide who eventually inherits a throne. But the sheer volume of surviving detail much of it written by people who had no reason to expect anyone outside the court to ever read it, gives historians an unusually close record of nights that were supposed to be private, and almost never were. What ties Catherine of Aragon, Anne of Cleves, Catherine the Great, Marie Antoinette, and Caroline of Brunswick together is not romance failing to arrive on schedule. It is the fact that for centuries, a royal marriage was treated as incomplete and legally vulnerable until it had been physically consummated, and confirming that consummation was considered everyone's business but the couple's own. A king or queen without an heir threatened the stability of an entire government. A marriage that could later be challenged as unconsummated could be annulled, taking with it any alliance, any dowry, and any children's claim to the throne. This was exactly the argument Henry VIII tried, unsuccessfully, to use against his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the same argument he used successfully against Anne of Cleves only a few decades afterward. Witnesses, attendants, mothers checking sheets, and physicians testifying years later in court were not unusual intrusions into royal life. They reflected how seriously a royal marriage was treated as a legal and financial arrangement, with the wedding night functioning as the final physical step required to complete it. The custom of public witnessing did eventually start to fade, though it took an unusually long time to disappear completely. King Charles I of England, who reigned from 1625 to 1649, is recorded as having personally barred the door of his own bedroom on his wedding night, refusing to allow the traditional audience inside. Despite his objection, the practice continued among European nobility for roughly another century afterward, as shown by the continued presence of witnesses at royal weddings well into the late 1600s and even into the 1700s in France. By the second half of the 18th century, the ritual had largely become symbolic rather than literal, even for royalty. Courtiers might still accompany a newly married couple to their bedroom door, as they did for Marie Antoinette, but a witnessed consummation, with attendants remaining inside the room itself, had become far rarer than it had been a century earlier. Even as the most invasive elements disappeared, the habit of escorting a royal couple to their bedroom door and waiting outside it lingered for several more generations before fading out entirely. By the 19th century, the practice had essentially disappeared from royal life altogether, replaced by a new set of values that prized modesty, personal privacy, and emotional intimacy within marriage rather than public proof of it. That shift becomes clear when comparing earlier royal wedding nights to the one recorded by Queen Victoria herself. When Victoria married Prince Albert in February 1840, there was no bedding ceremony, no priest blessing the marriage bed, and no attendants present once the couple retired for the night. Victoria, reigning as queen in her own right rather than as a king's wife, kept a private diary throughout her life, and her entry for that night survives largely intact. She wrote that she had never spent such an evening, describing her husband sitting beside her with obvious affection, and recorded the following morning that she had barely slept, overwhelmed by happiness at finding him beside her. There's no political negotiation in her account, no mention of witnesses, no concern about proving anything to anyone. It reads as the private record of two people who were, by most contemporary accounts, genuinely fond of each other. The contrast with Catherine of Aragon defending her virginity under oath, or Marie Antoinette's mother writing letters about bedroom strategy, or Catherine the Great lying awake next to a drunk sleeping teenager, is significant. In just over 2 centuries, the Queen's wedding night had moved from a public legal proceeding witnessed by strangers to a private memory recorded only in her own handwriting. What stands out across all of these stories is how rarely the people involved had any real say in what happened to them on that particular night. Brides were married as young as 14 to grooms they had often met only days earlier, then expected to perform a biological and legal function in front of an audience assembled specifically to confirm that they had done so. Some, like Catherine of Aragon, spent the rest of their lives defending a private detail under oath because an entire kingdom's religious future depended on the answer. Others, like Catherine the Great, simply lay awake next to a stranger and waited for a marriage that would not properly begin for years. Caroline of Brunswick spent her wedding night alone in a room with an unconscious husband on the floor, and spent the rest of her life paying for a marriage that had never had any real chance of working. The wedding night that modern audiences tend to picture as romantic and private was, for most of European royal history, neither.